The stranger asked whether I wanted the cedar workbench removed before closing. I stood in an airport hotel, holding my mother's funeral folder against my ribs. He introduced himself as Theo Grant, the buyer. Then he named my address, the listing price, and a closing date 12 days away. My thumb found the bare loop on my travel ring. The red cedar house key Owen had given me on our wedding day was missing. I told Theo I had never agreed to sell. I asked him not to confront anyone and requested his purchase timeline in writing. From my laptop, I ordered the title record. Both Owen and I were listed as owners. Any completed transfer required both of us. Grief had made me tired, not absent. I saved every message, thanked Theo, and decided to verify the plan before I accused my husband. The next morning, I called Nadia Brooks from the hotel desk, while the funeral home confirmed flower delivery on my other line. Nadia's voice began briskly and softened when I said I was Leena Hart. She had an exclusive listing agreement signed only by Owen. He had told her I approved the sale, that my mother's decline had taken me out of town, and that I would sign the remaining papers when I returned. Nadia had never spoken with me. I asked her to send the agreement, his messages, the listing history, and any notes about my supposed consent. She said, "I need to pause everything." I replied that pausing was sensible, but preserving the record mattered more. She understood. Before we ended, she admitted Owen had pushed for an unusually short marketing window and accepted Theo's offer within 48 hours. The haste was no longer an impression. It had timestamps. Her quick cooperation did not erase the mistake, but it separated error from continued deception. Theo's email arrived 10 minutes later. He had toured Hart Home twice with Nadia, paid a good faith deposit into the agency's holding account, and booked a survey. He had found my mobile number penciled years earlier inside the cedar studio cabinet because he was checking whether the attached workbench stayed. That small, ordinary note had reached me where formal courtesy had not. I called him back and explained only what I could verify. I was a documented owner, I had not consented, and the sale could not proceed as presented. I promised to help unwind his position without turning him into an accomplice to a marriage dispute. Theo sounded embarrassed, though he had done nothing wrong. "I thought I was buying from two people," he said. "So did I answered. It was the first joke of the week, and neither of us enjoyed it much. He had trusted the process. My task was to prevent that trust from becoming collateral. At my mother's apartment, I sorted medication receipts from utility bills, while relatives came and went with casseroles, folding chairs, and opinions. I did not tell them Owen had listed my home. The funeral belonged to my mother, not to my husband's emergency financing plan. Inside her cedar cabinet, I found the spare wooden bow she had carved when Owen and I bought Hart Home. She had made 2 matching red cedar key handles because she said metal alone felt too cold for a beginning. Mine had traveled on every serious trip for 16 years. Its absence now felt less sentimental than procedural. Someone had removed it from my ring before I flew out. I wrapped the spare bow in a tea towel and put it beside the folder containing her final arrangements. One object marked the life I was closing. The other had begun to explain the life waiting at home. I carried both folders to the kitchen, where cedar dust still lingered in one drawer. The funeral passed without spectacle. Owen stood beside me, accepted condolences, and carried boxes to relatives' cars with the polished usefulness that had once made me trust him. He did not mention the listing. I did not ask about it beside my mother's photographs. When he squeezed my shoulder, I noticed he still wore the watch I had given him after my first promotion. Familiarity can disguise itself as evidence of safety. That evening, after the last family member left, he said he needed to return early because of work. I let him. I had spent 14 years in hospital procurement, learning that urgency was often a sales tactic wearing a lanyard. The more someone insisted a decision could not wait, the more carefully I checked who benefited from the deadline. Owen kissed my forehead and promised to prepare the house for my return. In a narrow sense, he already had. I had no interest in borrowing my mother's mourners for a dispute she had never known. Back at the airport hotel, I opened the home camera account. Owen had changed the primary access password 6 days earlier, but the system retained device logs. His phone had entered the settings at 11:42 p.m. and removed my travel tablet. The front door camera showed movers measuring the hallway, Nadia arriving with a photographer, and Owen carrying my framed family photographs upstairs before each visit. None of it proved a completed sale. Together, it proved control of the staging process and an effort to keep me from seeing it. I exported the access history and requested the clips through the service's ordinary archive function. Evidence does not shout, it waits. At midnight, I stopped reviewing. My mother had taught me to iron linen napkins even for soup, but she had never suggested grief should be performed as limitless endurance. I closed the laptop and slept for 4 hours. The archive timestamps matched Nadia's schedule, tying the digital changes to each physical preparation. When I returned to Hart Home, the front hall smelled of lemon polish and unfamiliar reed diffuser. Our burgundy runner had disappeared. The brass console held a bowl of green apples we had not bought, arranged with the concentration of surgical instruments. My key did not fit because the lock cylinder had been changed. Owen opened the door after my second knock and said the locksmith had recommended an update after a neighborhood theft. He had not sent me the new code or key. Over his shoulder, I saw pale cushions replacing the ones my mother had sewn, and a listing photographer's floor markers still taped under the staircase. I asked for access, not an explanation. He handed me a plain metal key from his pocket. The cedar-handled one remained missing. A house can be jointly owned and still become lonely. Even the thermostat had been reset to a neutral temperature for buyers rather than residents. Upstairs, my winter clothes had been packed into moving boxes labeled with colored dots. The labels had no readable words, but the system was obvious: blue for keep, red for storage, yellow for donation. My mother's quilts were folded beneath a yellow sticker. Owen followed me, saying he had tried to reduce the burden I would face after the funeral. I photographed every box before opening it. Inside the study closet, I found a moving company estimate for transferring a 2-bedroom household to a rental complex across town. The estimate was dated before my mother's final hospitalization. That detail removed grief from his timeline. I carried the paper downstairs and placed it beside the bowl of apples. Owen asked whether we could discuss it after I had rested. I said I would rest after I understood why strangers had priced the rooms where I slept. He had packed my history with the efficiency of someone expecting approval to arrive later. I spent the afternoon making an inventory rather than a scene. I photographed the staged rooms, the packed belongings, the changed lock, and the empty wall where our joint property file had hung in a cedar frame. I downloaded current statements from our shared accounts and copied only what I was entitled to access. Then I moved my salary deposit to an individual account and left enough in the joint account for scheduled household expenses. I did not freeze cards, conceal funds, or create a crisis I could later pretend Owen had caused. Procurement had taught me the usefulness of a clean audit trail. Marriage had apparently provided the advanced course. In the kitchen, Owen made coffee and did not drink it. I told him we would talk that evening after I had reviewed the records. His relief at the delay lasted until he saw me photograph the new key. The camera made my hands look steadier than they felt, which was useful enough. The bank history showed a rental deposit paid from Owen's personal account, followed by 3 transfers to his brother over 4 months. The amounts were not enough to save a resort, but they were enough to show a pattern. A draft transfer, scheduled but not completed, was titled only with the resort's holding company. I printed the transaction confirmations and the rental receipt. The rental was a modest 2-bedroom unit with a lease start 5 days after the proposed closing. 2 occupants were listed: Owen and me. That was the first fact that contradicted the ugliest story my mind had offered. There was no second partner hidden in the paperwork. He had planned to move me with him. The betrayal narrowed, and because it narrowed, it cut more precisely. He had not erased our marriage from his plan. He had erased my vote. The lease start date showed he had planned not merely a sale, but our relocation. Before speaking to Owen, I called the moving company from the small desk at my mother's apartment. I identified myself as one of the household owners and asked for a copy of any estimate bearing my name. The coordinator sent a version requested by Owen, with notes stating that wife is traveling and that final dates would be confirmed after closing. No signature appeared beside my name. I thanked her and asked that no work be scheduled without written confirmation from both account holders. Then I reviewed my calendar and delegated 2 non-urgent supplier meetings. I was not going to let Owen's shortcuts create shortages on a surgical floor. My staff knew only that I had returned from bereavement leave and needed protected time. Competence can be a shelter, but only when it is not used to avoid the truth. At 6, I went home with the estimate in my bag and 1 question prepared. I also asked the coordinator to preserve her notes, and she agreed without drama. Owen was at the dining table when I laid down the listing agreement, the camera log, and the moving estimate. I asked him to explain the sequence, beginning with the first document rather than with his intention. He stared at Nadia's email as if she had betrayed him by keeping records. Then he said his brother's resort was weeks from default, that dozens of employees depended on it, and that our house had enough equity to help. I asked why he had represented my consent. "You would have said no before hearing the whole plan," he replied. That sentence did more work than an apology could have undone. Consent is not a chore you complete for someone. He insisted the sale was not final and that he had expected to tell me after the funeral, when I was home and calmer. I told him calm was not the same as compliant. We ended the conversation there because every additional sentence had begun to circle. He wanted motive to outrank method. I needed sequence first. The next day, I met Nadia at her office. She had printed the listing file and arranged it in chronological order without being asked, which told me both that she was frightened and that she was competent. Owen's signature appeared on the agency agreement. Beside the ownership question, he had written that his spouse approved and was unavailable due to a family emergency. Nadia showed me messages in which she repeatedly requested my contact. Owen had replied that I was overwhelmed, that direct calls would be intrusive, and that he would obtain my signature before formal transfer. She had accepted too much on reassurance, but she had not fabricated my approval. I said I would not accuse her publicly or threaten her livelihood. In return, I needed the listing paused, Theo's deposit protected, and every communication preserved. She agreed, then asked whether I wanted her to confront Owen. I said no. Facts were already doing that. Her file notes showed concern, but concern unacted upon had still allowed the listing forward. Theo joined us at the office that afternoon. He brought a slim folder containing his viewing schedule, offer, deposit receipt, survey booking, and a note from Owen offering to leave certain furniture if closing stayed on schedule. Theo was buying the house after a divorce and had chosen it partly because the studio seemed suited to furniture restoration. He apologized for calling me during the funeral week. I told him his call had been the most considerate act in the transaction. We compared dates. Owen had accepted the offer the evening before he flew to my mother's funeral, then told Theo through Nadia that both owners were eager for a clean closing. Theo asked whether he would lose his deposit. Nadia explained that the agency would hold it untouched while the ownership issue was formally resolved. I promised that whatever happened between Owen and me, I would not use Theo's money as leverage. His shoulders lowered by an inch. That promise gave Theo no advantage. It simply returned him to the position he deserved. From the office, we opened the current title record on a large monitor. Both names appeared with equal visibility, followed by the ordinary requirement that any transfer be executed by all documented owners or through another valid authority. There was no authority from me. No completed deed existed, and no one had forged one. That distinction mattered. Owen had built pressure toward a future signature. He had not crossed every possible line. Nadia also showed us the marketing dashboard. The listing had been marked "Coming Soon" for 3 days, "Publicly Active" for 2, and "Offer Accepted" on the 3rd. I downloaded copies with timestamps. Theo asked why someone would risk so much when the title check was routine. I said because Owen had not expected the process to reach the point where my absence became visible. He had counted on emotion to finish what paperwork could not. Routine records had exposed the gap, because routine systems are difficult to charm. Owen's relatives began calling that evening. His brother left a message saying the resort had survived 3 generations and that family should not watch family drown over technical ownership. An aunt said Owen had been under unbearable pressure. I returned 1 message, not 6. I said the house was jointly owned, the proposed sale lacked my consent, and no one should make financial decisions assuming my share would become available. I did not discuss the funeral, the marriage, or the resort's management. Then I blocked further calls until mediation. Owen accused me of humiliating his brother by refusing to speak. I pointed out that I had told no one outside the necessary transaction. He had recruited the audience. That night, he slept in the study. I slept in our bedroom with the plain replacement key on the bedside table, its cold metal catching the hallway light. Boundaries sounded cruel only to people who had budgeted for my surrender. An independent appraiser visited Hart Home 2 days later. Owen and I agreed in writing that the visit did not commit either of us to a sale or buyout. I walked through the rooms alone while he waited in the garden, and I noticed how thoroughly the staging had edited our life. My mother's curtains were boxed. Owen's golf photographs remained because they looked neutral. The cedar studio cabinet had been emptied except for the workbench Theo had asked about. Under its lower shelf, I found the small screw cup where I used to keep my travel spare. It was empty. The appraiser measured walls, noted repairs, and left without offering an opinion. I liked her for that. Professionals who refuse to perform certainty are underrated. When Owen came back inside, I asked again for my cedar-handled key. He said he did not know where it was. The replacement key stayed there all night, a practical object with an accusation built into it. The rental receipt gave me the property manager's contact details. I wrote, rather than called, and stated that my name appeared as an intended occupant, although I had not applied or agreed. The manager replied that Owen alone had signed the reservation and paid the deposit. My name had been entered as a spouse expected to join before move-in. They removed it and confirmed the deposit remained Owen's responsibility. I forwarded that confirmation to him. He came into the kitchen holding his phone and asked whether I was trying to make reconciliation impossible. I said I was making unauthorized commitments impossible. There was a difference. He sat down and rubbed both hands over his face. For the first time, charm left him entirely. He looked 47, exhausted, and frightened of a future he had tried to schedule without me. Her silence kept the appraisal useful instead of turning it into another argument. That night, Owen finally described the plan without the polished language. His brother's resort had missed payments, suppliers were demanding cash, and a lender would extend time only if the family injected new money. Owen believed his expected share of our equity could bridge the gap. He had reserved the rental because it was cheaper, near my hospital, and available immediately. "I wasn't leaving you," he said. "I was moving us." There was no affair, no hidden second life, no fantasy of disappearing. He had intended to bring me into a smaller home after converting our largest shared asset into his brother's rescue fund. The revelation did not soften the act. It clarified it. He had mistaken my quiet for an empty room. I asked whether his brother knew I had not agreed. Owen said he had told him I would understand once the crisis passed. He had confused my removing my name with my removing him. They were not equivalent. I asked Owen what would have happened if I refused at the closing table. He said he would have delayed, explained, asked his family to speak with me, and shown me the resort's books. Each answer was a new form of pressure presented as consultation. I asked when he had planned to return my key. He looked toward the hallway and admitted he had removed it from my ring so the locksmith could copy its dimensions before changing the cylinder. Then he had misplaced it during staging. That small admission changed the key's meaning again. It was no longer only a wedding symbol or a missing object. It was proof that access had become something he allocated. I told him we would use a neutral mediator and separate bedrooms until the property decision was complete. He agreed because agreement was now the least expensive option available to him. The plan was domestic, detailed, and almost tender in every place except the one that mattered. The appraisal arrived at 4% above Theo's accepted offer. Owen seized on the number as evidence that we could sell quickly, fund the resort, and still move comfortably. I saw something else, a fair value that gave us room to make a transparent decision rather than honor a rushed one. I sent the report to a family property mediator, Evelyn Shaw, whose name came from a workplace assistance list. Her intake form asked each of us to identify desired outcomes, documents, and non-negotiable boundaries. Mine were plain. Return Theo's deposit promptly, disclose all property-related commitments, preserve each owner's lawful share, and decide between a supported buyout or an open sale. Reconciliation was not an item on the form. Owen wrote that he wanted to preserve the marriage and help his brother. Evelyn scheduled the first session for the following week. I chose her because neutrality felt less flattering and therefore more likely to help. Evelyn's first session was deliberately narrow. She placed a yellow pad between us and said the purpose was not to decide who had the better marriage speech. It was to identify what could still be decided lawfully and what harm could be reduced. Owen began with the resort. Evelyn stopped him and asked for the house timeline first. I watched him list the agreement, photography, offer, rental, and planned transfer in an order that sounded almost reasonable until she asked where my consent entered. He said it had been anticipated. Evelyn wrote that word down. She did not react, but it looked flimsy on paper. We agreed to exchange full records related to the house and rental, obtain a second market opinion, and authorize Nadia to release Theo's deposit once the agency completed its process. No one promised forgiveness. The session ended with assignments, which suited me better than emotion disguised as progress. For once, the next step did not depend on whichever person sounded most wounded. Returning Theo's deposit required signatures confirming the transaction would not proceed. Owen resisted for a day because he believed keeping the offer alive preserved leverage. I reminded him that the offer had been accepted on a false premise about my consent and that Theo should not finance our indecision. Evelyn sent a neutral note explaining that releasing the funds did not determine the eventual disposition of Hart Home. Owen signed. Nadia processed the release and sent confirmation to all of us. Theo replied with 2 sentences. He appreciated the clarity, and he hoped we found a fair resolution. I printed that email for the file, not because it was evidence against Owen, but because it marked the first practical harm we had repaired. Quiet revenge was never my aim. Quiet correction was difficult enough. At work, I approved a replacement supplier after 3 departments documented the need. The contrast was almost rude. The confirmation also ended the artificial 12-day clock Owen had built around all of us. Owen provided the resort documents Evelyn requested, though they were not documents that could obligate me. They showed a real business in distress, falling bookings, deferred maintenance, supplier arrears, and a refinancing proposal contingent on family capital. His brother had not invented the crisis. Several long-term employees could lose work if it failed. I read every page because compassion did not require ignorance. Then I separated the resort's need from its claim on our house. There were other family investors, possible asset sales, and professional restructuring options, none guaranteed. Owen had chosen our equity because it was familiar and because he believed I could be persuaded after the fact. I told him I was sorry his brother was facing collapse. I also said sorrow did not create ownership. He nodded, but his mouth tightened. He still wanted my refusal to feel like a moral failure rather than a boundary. Need can explain a choice without granting it permission to spend another person's future. The second market opinion came from an agent who had no connection to Nadia. It supported the appraisal and recommended several weeks of ordinary exposure rather than a rushed private closing. Hart Home needed minor repairs, fresh photographs, and honest disclosure about the studio fixtures. Owen proposed that he buy my share using a loan secured by future repayment from his brother. Evelyn asked for written financing. The bank would consider only Owen's current income and verified assets, not hoped-for resort recovery. His preliminary amount fell well below what a fair buyout required. I did not reject it with satisfaction. A supported buyout would have let him keep the house and spared us a move. But pretending the gap did not exist would merely repeat his method with kinder vocabulary. We recorded that the buyout was presently unworkable and turned to an open sale. A smaller number written honestly was safer than a larger number supported by family optimism. The decision cost me more than paperwork. Hart Home was close to the hospital, and its small studio had been where my mother taught me to repair drawer joints and sand cedar without rounding the edges. I had paid more of the original deposit from savings earned before the marriage, but both names were on the title, and both of us had contributed across 16 years. I refused the tempting fiction that my larger beginning made the whole house mine. Our written agreement and the local process would determine the distribution after costs. That did not make Owen's conduct smaller, it kept my response honest. I began looking at compact rentals and townhouses within a sensible commute. The first had a kitchen window facing a brick wall. The second had carpet the color of apologetic oatmeal. Practical freedom rarely arrives staged. I began a spreadsheet of commute, cost, storage, and light, because feelings needed shelves too. At my mother's apartment, I opened the cedar cabinet and removed the doors, shelves, and warped back panel. The estate had been simple, and the landlord had agreed that I could take the cabinet before the unit was cleared. My mother had built it from salvaged cedar when I was a teenager. Owen once helped her attach the brass hinges, though he had complained cheerfully about her measuring everything twice. I decided the sound pieces could become a workbench in whatever smaller place I chose. The choice mattered because I was no longer preserving every object as proof that a family had existed correctly. Some things could change form without becoming lies. I found a shallow groove inside the cabinet where my phone number remained faintly penciled, the note Theo had seen. I sanded around it, leaving the numbers unreadable but the mark intact. Cedar has a clean, dry scent when cut, less like perfume than a remembered room. Nadia prepared a cancellation file for the old listing and a separate proposal for a future transparent one. She offered to waive part of her fee because she had relied on Owen's assurances without contacting me. I accepted a modest reduction, not a punishment. She had paused the transaction as soon as she learned the truth, preserved the messages, and helped return Theo's money. Accountability did not require me to flatten every mistake into conspiracy. We agreed that if Owen and I chose her again, both owners would approve the price, photographs, fixtures, showing rules, and any offer in writing. Nadia also gave me the original cedar-handled key. A photographer had found it beneath a sofa cushion and left it in the office lost property drawer. The redwood was scratched, but intact. I did not put it back on my ring. I placed it in the evidence envelope for mediation. She also documented her own process failure, which made future trust possible without making it automatic. Owen's family tried one final coordinated appeal. His brother sent a spreadsheet projecting how the resort could repay us within 3 years. 2 relatives copied me on messages about loyalty, legacy, and the shame of selling a family business. I responded once, attaching no private marriage records. I said I would not invest house proceeds in the resort and I asked them to stop treating my property decision as a vote on whether their family deserved help. Owen read my reply and said I had closed the door too hard. I told him the door had been used for weeks without my key. That ended the discussion. Later, he admitted his brother had known the sale was not fully signed, but believed Owen could bring me around. The plan had been focused, not solitary. Still, Owen had made the promise. I kept responsibility where it belonged. I declined further attachments and asked that future communication pass through Evelyn. We spent a Saturday preparing Hart Home for a legitimate sale. Owen repaired a loose stair rail while I unpacked items that had been wrongly marked for donation. We worked with the careful civility of colleagues closing a department. At noon, he found my mother's burgundy cushions in the garage and set them on the sofa without comment. I put the staged green apples into a pie, mostly because waste offended me, and partly because their perfection had become insulting. The pie was mediocre. Owen ate 2 slices. For an hour, our old domestic rhythm returned, stripped of innocence but not of all kindness. Then he asked whether selling openly meant I might still move with him afterward. I said the property decision and the marriage decision were separate. He had fused them once. I would not do it again. The ordinary work felt almost peaceful because every object moved with both owners' knowledge. Evelyn asked each of us to prepare a concise statement for the decisive session. What happened, what result we requested, and what boundary followed. Mine fit on 1 page. I attached the listing agreement, Nadia's messages, camera access logs, moving estimate, rental confirmation, transfer history, title record, appraisal, second market opinion, and Theo's released deposit confirmation. I did not include every painful remark. A binder is not improved by making it heavier than the truth. Owen's packet focused on the resort's urgency, his intent to keep our marriage, and his belief that a fast sale had been financially rational. Both packets were exchanged 2 days before mediation. That evening, he knocked on my bedroom door and said reading my timeline made his choices look calculated. I answered that dates often remove the comfort of improvisation. He did not argue. He had not been unlucky with appearances. He had been accurate in sequence. Before the final session, I visited the hospital's records office to return a borrowed scanner and found myself explaining none of this to anyone. That restraint surprised me. Months earlier, I might have wanted witnesses simply to confirm I was not overreacting. Now the documents had made private certainty possible. I reviewed our joint expenses one last time and proposed a temporary arrangement through the sale. Mortgage, insurance, utilities, and necessary repairs paid proportionally from the joint account. Personal spending kept separate. No new debt secured against the property. Owen accepted after Evelyn revised 2 phrases neither of us liked. The written arrangement was unremarkable, which was its strength. It prevented fresh emergencies from appearing between old arguments. At home, I placed the red cedar key in a plain envelope, then removed it. It belonged on the table where the choice had been taken, not hidden in packaging. The arrangement also protected Owen from any retaliatory impulse I might later have regretted. The decisive mediation began with ordinary coffee in paper cups and a window that looked onto a parking structure. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, Owen across from me, our document packets aligned between us. The red cedar key rested beside my binder. Its scratched wooden bow caught the restrained brass light. Evelyn reminded us that she would help structure an agreement, not determine guilt or force reconciliation. Owen asked to speak first. He said he had panicked when his brother's lender set a deadline. He believed Hart Home was more space than we needed. The rental was practical, and the resort could repay the family after recovery. He admitted he had handled the listing badly. Badly was a small word placed over a large sequence. I waited until he finished, because interruption would not improve the record. Evelyn's coffee tasted burnt, which gave the meeting one harmless thing we could agree about. I began with the listing agreement. Owen had signed it 3 weeks before my mother died, which ended any suggestion that bereavement alone had triggered a desperate improvisation. I placed Nadia's messages beside it. In each one, she asked to contact me. In each answer, Owen described me as consenting but unavailable. Next came the camera log showing my access removed before photography, followed by the moving estimate created while I still believed we were discussing minor renovations. I did not raise my voice. The order did the work. Owen said he had been trying to reduce stress because I was already carrying too much. I replied that reducing my information had increased his control. Evelyn asked him whether any document showed my approval before the offer. He looked through his packet, though all three of us knew it did not. The chronology made his protection argument impossible to separate from the secrecy required to perform it. Then I placed the rental confirmation on the table. My name had been entered as an expected occupant without my application. Beside it, I set the draft transfer to the resort company and the earlier payments to Owen's brother. The numbers established that the house proceeds had a destination before I was told there was a decision. Owen objected that the transfer was only a draft. I agreed. It had not moved, just as the deed had not been completed. I was not accusing him of acts he had not done. I was showing the path he had built toward acts requiring my signature. That distinction made him quieter than accusation would have. Evelyn summarized the point. There was no forged, completed transfer, but there had been a coordinated effort to create momentum, commitments, and family pressure before Leena was invited to participate. Owen did not dispute her wording. Precision kept the conversation from becoming a trial of character rather than a review of choices. I added the title record last. Both names were present, plain and equal. The record did not care that my premarital savings had supplied more of the deposit, and it did not care that Owen considered the resort rescue morally urgent. It required both owners for a completed transfer. I set the red cedar key on top of the page. I explained that Owen had removed it from my travel ring, changed the lock, disabled my camera access, and planned to hand me a new rental key after the sale. The object was not proof of ownership by itself. It was proof of how he had treated access while trying to control the timing. Evelyn asked whether I wanted a break. I said no. I had one question left, and it was the only one that mattered to the marriage. For the first time, he seemed to understand that incompletion did not make preparation harmless. I looked at Owen and asked, "At what point had you planned to let me choose?" He opened his mouth, then looked down at the key. He said he had planned to explain after the funeral, before final signing. I asked whether a choice made after the house was staged, an offer accepted, a rental reserved, money promised, and relatives prepared to pressure me was still a choice. He said he had believed I would understand. I waited. He tried again, saying he had believed I would eventually agree. That was the answer. He had not planned a moment of choice. He had planned a point of surrender. Evelyn did not decorate the conclusion. She asked Owen whether he could identify any stage at which my refusal would have been accepted without pressure or financial blame. He could not. The silence was not dramatic. It was complete. I had expected anger, but the answer left me with a colder and cleaner certainty. Owen's final argument was that saving the resort would have helped the whole family. It might have preserved jobs, protected his brother, and created future income. I did not deny those possibilities. I said a beneficial outcome could not retroactively supply consent, especially when the risks would have fallen on an asset we both owned. He apologized for lying to Nadia and excluding me, then promised he would never make another major decision without me. I believed he regretted the consequences. I also believed he might mean the promise in that moment. Neither belief restored the condition required for marriage, that my personhood did not depend on his assessment of my likely answer. I told him I would not reconcile on the strength of another promise made after discovery. I wanted an orderly sale, a fair distribution through our written agreement and local process, and separate lives. My boundary was not punishment, it was the consequence of finally believing the documented pattern. Evelyn drafted the settlement framework while we remained at the table. Hart Home would be listed openly with both owners' written approval. Necessary sale costs would be documented. Neither of us would commit the other's proceeds to any third party. Personal property would be divided by inventory, with disputed items held aside rather than removed. The red cedar key sat between us through every revision. Owen asked whether he could keep the house if financing improved before listing. I agreed to a brief deadline for a fully supported buyout, because fairness did not become weakness merely because he had exploited it. If financing failed, the sale would proceed. We both signed the mediation summary. No one declared victory. On the way out, Owen reached toward the key, then stopped. I put it in my pocket. It was still mine to return. The brief buyout window kept the outcome fair without handing delay back to Owen as leverage. The buyout deadline passed without adequate financing. Owen's brother could not guarantee repayment, and the bank would not treat hope as collateral. Nadia relaunched Hart Home only after receiving both our signatures on the price, fixtures, showing schedule, and photograph approval. The new listing stayed active for 3 weeks. We received several offers, including one above the independent appraisal with ordinary conditions and a realistic closing period. Theo did not bid again. He had found another property with a detached workshop. He sent Nadia a photograph of an empty bench space, and she forwarded it with his permission. I was glad he had not needed our ending to begin his own. Owen and I accepted the strongest supported offer together. Watching both signatures appear on the same page felt less romantic than our wedding, but far more honest. The ordinary conditions mattered. No one was being asked to absorb our urgency again. Packing the house a second time was slower and cleaner. We used the inventory agreed in mediation. Owen kept his father's dining set and the golf photographs. I kept my mother's tools, the burgundy cushions, and the cedar cabinet pieces. We sold items neither of us wanted and deposited the proceeds into the joint account. Once, Owen held up a chipped blue bowl and asked whether either of us had ever liked it. We had received it from a distant cousin and preserved it for 16 years out of mutual cowardice. We laughed, then put it in the donation box. Humor did not repair us, but it allowed one truthful minute without negotiation. On the final evening, the studio stood empty except for sawdust lines where the old workbench had rested. I swept them toward the door and carried the cedar boards out myself. We wrapped the cedar boards in old hospital blankets I had bought at a charity sale. Closing occurred through the ordinary process with both owners present or represented as required, every figure visible, and no last-minute appeal from the resort. The net proceeds were divided according to our written agreement and the applicable local process after costs. My larger original deposit was considered only to the extent the documents supported, not as a story I could enlarge because I was hurt. Owen received his lawful share. What he chose to do with it was no longer mine to manage, though I knew he sent some money to his brother and kept enough for housing. The resort entered a formal restructuring rather than receiving the rescue Owen had imagined. Some operations continued, some did not. Reality was less tidy than his plan, but it belonged to the people actually responsible for it. I wished the workers well from a distance and refused to become the resort's unofficial auditor. 9 months later, I lived in the compact, sunlit townhouse where my mother had spent her final years. After her lease ended, the owner renovated it and offered me a standard tenancy at a price I could carry easily. The commute to the hospital was 12 minutes longer, and the kitchen was narrow enough that opening the dishwasher blocked the refrigerator, a design choice that encouraged patience. In the front room, I rebuilt my mother's cedar cabinet into a workbench with brass brackets and a shallow drawer for keys. The old penciled groove remained beneath the surface. Morning light warmed the cedar brown and turned the scratches into grain rather than damage. I had less square footage, lower monthly costs, and no room that existed mainly to impress visitors. The place felt chosen because every compromise had been mine to make. I bought one folding chair too few, which made large gatherings conveniently self-limiting. Owen and I communicated through practical channels about tax forms and 2 remaining boxes. He attended counseling on his own and once sent a careful apology that named the listing, the access changes, the pressure, and the assumption beneath them. I thanked him for being specific. I did not reopen the marriage. An apology can be accurate without becoming a bridge. Nadia later told me she had changed her office procedure. Every documented owner received direct contact before a listing went live. Theo mailed a photograph of the first table he restored in his new workshop. I pinned it above the cedar bench, not as a trophy, but as proof that protecting an innocent buyer had cost me nothing I needed to keep. At the hospital, I accepted a regional procurement role with 1 work-from-home day, enough advancement to be useful and not enough to become a rescue fantasy. Specificity mattered because vague remorse had once been the doorway through which pressure returned. On a Tuesday evening, I placed Owen's old red cedar house key in a plain envelope. I did not add a letter. The sale had ended its function, and mediation had already supplied the words. I left the envelope with the last box at Evelyn's office for documented collection, then returned to my townhouse before dark. My new key had a simple brass bow and a muted burgundy cord I had tied myself. I hung it in the shallow drawer of the cedar workbench beside my mother's small measuring square. The wedding key had begun as a promise, become a tool of exclusion, and finished as an object I could return without surrendering anything. I did not need the last word. I needed the next key. The workbench held no spare promises. And when you are ready, stay for another original story about the quiet moments someone chooses their own life.